Why did the radio suddenly go quiet, right when everyone expected it to scream? The blizzard swallowed sound the way the mountains swallowed hope. Snow tore sideways through the valley, erasing distance, swallowing shapes, bending reality until up felt like sideways and forward felt like nowhere. Lieutenant Commander Cole Maddox pressed his shoulder harder into the frozen rock, the weight of command heavier than the gear cutting into his ribs. Breath burned, fingers numbed, time stretched into something fragile. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Bravo 2 had come for paper, a document grab, quiet, clean, in and out before the weather collapsed. Instead, 50 men rose from the snow like the mountain itself had decided to fight back. The first explosion came without warning. No buildup, no mercy, just force. Logan Shaw was lifted off his feet and thrown like debris, bone through fabric, blood on white. Tyler Knox dragged him behind the Humvee and paid for it with shrapnel across his back. Everything after that blurred into shouting, gunfire, and the awful clarity that came when the math stopped working. Snipers high ridge, long range. Even the best riflemen in perfect conditions would struggle at that distance. In a whiteout, it wasn't hard, it was impossible. "How long for evac?" someone shouted. 40 minutes, Maddox answered, already knowing what that meant. They didn't have 40 minutes. He switched frequencies with a kind of quiet desperation commanders never admit to. A channel that existed more in rumor than reality. A protocol that wasn't supposed to be real anymore. "Frost protocol," he said into the storm. "Enemies at 2,100 meters, 2 critical casualties, requesting assistance." Only static answered. Someone muttered that she was dead. Maddox kept the mic keyed anyway. And then the static changed. "Repeat your grid." The voice was calm, female, unmistakably real. Everything stopped. Not the storm, not the gunfire, but something inside every man crouched in that valley. She asked where they were in relation to the Humvee. She told them not to move. Then she went silent again. Doubt crept in, fear sharpened. Mortars began walking closer. The wounded slipped toward shock, and beneath their boots, unseen and unacknowledged, something else waited. 3 years earlier, she had learned what it felt like to fall into a grave made of ice. Her name had been Mara Keene once. She had grown up where winter taught lessons early and without kindness. Her father taught her wind before words. Her mother taught her patience with a rifle before fear could take root. She learned that survival wasn't strength, it was attention. The army noticed. Sniper school barely slowed her, but the mountains did. Afghanistan stripped illusions away. The Arctic finished the job. During an operation no one talked about openly, she answered a call she wasn't ordered to take. Rangers were dying in a valley swallowed by weather. Air couldn't reach them. Artillery would have killed everyone. They needed someone who could see through chaos. Mara went anyway. She and her spotter vanished into the storm and reappeared only as results. Targets dropped at distances no one liked to talk about. Commanders survived. Rangers lived. Her spotter didn't. When the mission should have ended, she stayed. Grief is loud when it's fresh. It tells you to keep moving, to keep shooting, to punish the world for what it took. She ran out of ammunition, then luck. Then ice broke. She fell into darkness so cold it erased pain. Her body shattered against stone. Her rifle was gone, her radio dead, the world closed in. She refused. For 2 days she clawed upward through ice with broken ribs and frostbitten fingers. Inch by inch, breath by breath. When she surfaced, the search teams were gone, the paperwork already written. She could go back. Or she could stay dead. She stayed dead. When Maddox heard her voice again beneath the storm, he didn't know any of that. He only knew the sound of a rifle cracking from below the earth itself. One shot, then another. "Mortar team down," the voice said. "You have 85 seconds." She rose from beneath the Humvee like a shadow deciding to become solid. She didn't announce herself, didn't rush, didn't explain. She asked for casualty status while adjusting her scope with movements so small they looked like breathing. Her calm wasn't forced, it was earned. She named threats no one else could see. She described men she had been tracking for hours. She fired, and distant shapes fell without drama. The storm didn't bother her. It spoke to her. Wind wasn't noise, it was information. Snow wasn't blindness, it was texture. Where others saw chaos, she saw math. Someone asked if she was really the Frost Widow. She didn't answer. She eliminated the ridge snipers. She shattered the infantry's confidence. She didn't hurry, she didn't miss. Each shot carried intention, not anger. When an RPG team threatened the Humvee, she coordinated fire with surgical precision. When the team needed to move, she already had a plan. When panic crept in, she cut it off with quiet certainty. She handled the wounded with gentleness that didn't fit the legend, fingers careful, voice low, as if reminding herself that people were still breakable things. At the cave, when flankers tried to collapse the entrance, she did something no one would ever officially write down. She stood up into open fire and broke physics with discipline and repetition. Impossible just means someone hasn't practiced enough, she said afterward without pride. When the helicopter came, she packed her gear. They asked her to come with them. She refused. Because going back meant becoming a story someone else owned, becoming evidence, becoming something discussed instead of something useful. She stepped into the storm instead. Back at base, the debriefs were long and sterile. Intelligence officers searched for explanations that didn't require belief, stress, confusion, friendly fire, weather. Maddox didn't argue much. He knew how institutions protected themselves from uncertainty. Ghosts didn't fit into reports. But some things don't need validation to be real. Months later, when another storm rolled in and another route nearly killed his team, a familiar voice warned him in time. He listened. Somewhere far away, a woman cleaned her rifle by lamplight and waited. She didn't think of herself as a hero. Heroes come home. She was something else. A response. A debt unpaid. A presence beneath your feet when the world collapses. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It waits. And when the moment comes, it acts. What kind of person survives being buried alive by ice and then chooses not to return? The first thing Mara remembered wasn't pain. It was silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating absence of everything that told you where you were. No wind, no echo, just pressure. Cold so absolute it felt like being erased rather than frozen. Her body lay twisted against stone 30 feet below the surface of the glacier, breath shallow, ribs screaming every time her lungs dared to expand. She had fallen into a grave, the mountain never meant to give back. Her helmet was gone. Her radio was shattered somewhere above. Night vision, rifle, pack stripped away in the fall like offerings to the ice. Blood pooled warm against her side for a few seconds before the cold stole even that. When she tried to move, her left shoulder didn't respond. Dislocated. Maybe worse. Fingers burned, then went numb. Frostbite had already started its quiet work. Most people in that moment would have let go. Mara didn't. Not because she was brave, not because she believed she'd survive, but because quitting felt like a choice, and she had spent her entire life learning how dangerous choices could be. She lay still for a long time, counting breaths, letting the panic crest and break. Her father's voice echoed in memory, steady and unkind. Panic wastes oxygen. Oxygen is time. She tested her legs. Pain flared, but they worked. She tested her right arm, functional. Left arm screamed and went dead halfway through the motion. Okay, she thought, one arm, broken ribs, ice walls smooth as glass, no rope, no radio, no one coming. She laughed once, a short, broken sound that vanished immediately into the dark. Then she began to climb. It took her 2 days. 2 days of inching upward, finding tiny imperfections in the ice with numb fingertips, wedging boots into cracks barely wide enough to exist. Every pull sent lightning through her chest. Every slip threatened to undo hours of progress. She slept standing up, wedged between walls, drifting in and out of consciousness, afraid that real sleep would mean never waking again. At one point, delirium took hold. She heard her spotter's voice below her, calm and teasing, asking if she needed help. She didn't answer. She knew better than to talk to ghosts. When she finally broke through the surface, the world exploded into light and wind. Snow blinded her. The storm had worsened. Visibility was nothing. And yet, 20 meters away, half buried in a drift like a miracle she hadn't earned, lay her rifle. She cried then, not loudly, just a quiet release as she dragged herself across the snow and wrapped frozen fingers around familiar steel. The search teams were gone. They had been thorough. They had found blood, torn gear, the edge of the crevasse. They had done the math and moved on. Realistically, they were right. She spent a week moving through the wilderness, surviving on instinct, half-frozen rations, and whatever she could hunt. When her strength finally collapsed, she stumbled into an abandoned weather station and patched herself together with veterinary supplies meant for animals tougher than people. By the time she could walk again, her name was already being etched into memorials. That was when the choice came. Go back, be recovered, be studied, be reminded every day of the man who died because she stayed too long. Or disappear. She chose silence. Years later, beneath a Humvee in a blizzard, that silence moved with her. Maddox had felt it before he understood it, a wrongness in the air, not danger, something else, as if the mountain itself had decided to lean closer and listen. When the first suppressed shot cracked from beneath the vehicle, it bypassed reason and went straight to instinct. Men dropped flat, hands tightened on triggers, eyes searched where eyes had no business searching. Underneath. She slid out slowly, deliberately, giving them time to recalibrate their reality. White blending into white, gear worn thin and purposeful, no insignia, no markings, only function. The rifle was an extension of her body, not a tool. Frost clung to it like a second skin. She didn't look at them when she spoke. She didn't need to. "Lieutenant Commander Maddox," she said, already knowing the answer to questions he hadn't asked yet. "Casualty status." He answered because something in her tone didn't allow hesitation. She listened, calculated, adjusted. Then she began, removing pieces from the storm. She didn't think of the enemy as men in that moment. She couldn't afford to. She thought of them as variables, movement patterns, heat signatures, weight shifts. One smoked. One trusted his scope too much. One leaned left when nervous. She waited for the wind to dip between gusts, for snow density to thin just enough, for the mountain to breathe out. Then she fired. Distance didn't matter to her anymore. It hadn't for a long time. The shot existed before she pulled the trigger. Her body simply followed instructions her mind had already solved. The second sniper went down relocating. The third never realized relocation was the mistake. She spoke numbers quietly, not as bragging but as anchors. Count the work, stay present, don't drift. When Maddox asked how she could see anything, she almost smiled. She remembered being new once, remembered believing visibility was about eyes. "It's not about seeing," she said. "It's about listening long enough that the storm starts talking back." The infantry hesitated when Overwatch went silent. That hesitation killed them. Fear always made people loud, predictable. She used it the way her father used wind, never fighting it, only adjusting. When the RPG team surfaced, she coordinated with the SEALs not as a superior, not as a subordinate, but as a necessary force sliding into a gap. When she moved, they moved. When she spoke, they trusted without understanding why. Trust was a strange thing. It didn't need proof in moments like this. It only needed results. She felt the wounded when she knelt beside them, the fragile heat of blood against frozen ground. The way pain made men small. It reminded her why she stayed gone, why she lived between places instead of inside them. When the cave fight came, it was the closest she allowed herself to anger. Standing into open fire wasn't courage. It was calculation refined through repetition. 3 shots, shoulder, launcher, rocket. Timing measured not in seconds but in muscle memory burned deep enough to bypass fear. Afterward, when they stared at her like she'd stepped out of myth, she corrected them softly. Impossible was lazy thinking. Math never lied. Bodies did what physics allowed if you trained them long enough. Extraction was inevitable once the enemy broke. She knew that too, knew when her usefulness ended. That was the part she struggled with. Leaving. Because staying meant answers, names, forms, explanations. And explanations always came with expectations. She had spent years shedding those. When Maddox asked her to come back, she almost said yes. Almost. Not because she wanted the world back, but because for a brief, dangerous second, she wanted to believe she could belong in it again. Instead, she stepped into the storm. Because some people survive things that separate them permanently from ordinary life. They don't become better or worse, just different, necessary only in moments no one wants to plan for. Back at base, when officers debated stress and misinterpretation, she listened from far away, radio low, frequencies dancing across static. She heard her name spoken like a rumor and ignored it. Names were heavy, she traveled lighter now. She kept moving, mountains changed, storms repeated, fear sounded the same everywhere. And when the radio crackled with voices tight with desperation, when someone whispered a grid they weren't supposed to use anymore, she listened. Not because she was a hero, but because once you've crawled out of your own grave, you understand something others don't. Life isn't fair. Survival isn't noble. And sometimes the only redemption left is choosing to answer when no one else can. What happens to someone who keeps saving others while refusing to be seen? Mara learned that silence has weight. Not immediately. At first it felt like freedom. No briefings, no chain of command, no after-action reports dissecting every breath she took. The mountains didn't ask her why she survived when others didn't. The storm didn't care who she used to be. Out there, between ridgelines and white horizons, she was Sergeant Keene or a classified anomaly. She was just another moving shape trying not to freeze. But over time, silence presses inward. It fills the space where voices used to be. It sharpens memories until they cut without warning. She felt it most at night. In the cabin she'd built with her own hands, deep in the Calder Peaks, the wind rattled the walls like fingers tapping for entry. An oil lamp burned low. Her rifle lay across her knees, stripped down, cleaned, reassembled with ritual precision. Every movement was familiar enough to quiet her mind. Almost. Sometimes she heard Mason's voice anyway. Her old spotter, not screaming, never screaming, just calm the way he'd always been, asking if the wind was lying tonight, teasing her about her coffee, trusting her completely. Trust was the hardest thing to carry. She had tried to ignore the radios at first, left them off, told herself she was done, but silence didn't mean peace, it just meant waiting without purpose. Eventually she powered one on, then another, then more. Old habits returned quietly, the way muscle memory always did. She listened. Patterns emerged. How voices changed when fear crept in. How commanders pretended calm even when their math didn't work anymore. How desperation sounded the same across continents. She never answered right away. Not because she didn't care, because she did. Every time she intervened, the cost came later. In dreams. In the ache behind her eyes when the shooting stopped and she had time to remember faces. Not enemies. Hers. The first time she nearly failed was 6 months after Bravo 2. A joint patrol, pinned in a narrow ravine where sound bounced wrong and distance collapsed. Not SEALs this time. A mixed unit. Younger voices. Less experience hiding behind confidence that hadn't been tested yet. They called the Frost Protocol frequency by accident, reading off an outdated card someone had forgotten to shred. She almost turned the radio off. She was tired. Her fingers still hadn't fully recovered from the frostbite. Her left shoulder ached in the cold, a permanent reminder that bodies remember what minds try to forget. But then she heard the hesitation in the voice giving the grid. Not panic yet, but close. She moved. The approach took longer than she calculated. Weather shifted unexpectedly. Wind lied to her once. It hadn't done that in years. By the time she reached her firing position, the engagement had already escalated. She took her first shot and missed. Not by much, but enough. The sound echoed differently than it should have. The enemy reacted faster than anticipated. A return round clipped rock inches from her head, spraying ice and stone across her face. Her heart spiked. For the first time since the crevasse, doubt punched through her discipline. You're not invincible, the thought whispered. You never were. She adjusted, fired again, corrected, stabilized. The team survived, barely. Extraction came late. She never revealed herself. She left before the storm cleared. But the miss followed her home. She replayed it at night, over and over. Calculations, variables, fatigue, age, accumulated damage. The truth sat heavy in her chest. She was human. And humans break eventually. The next time she heard Frost Protocol, she waited too long. That one ended differently. Not catastrophic, but not clean. A man lost a leg because she arrived minutes later than she should have. He lived, but she knew the difference between survival and cost. She sat in the snow afterward, rifle resting against her shoulder, and let the wind burn her eyes until tears froze on her cheeks. This isn't sustainable, she said aloud, though no one was there to hear it. Being invisible meant no one rotated you out. No one checked your limits. No one told you when to stop. The world would take everything you offered and ask for more. She considered disappearing completely, cutting the radios, leaving the mountains, becoming truly gone. Then another storm rolled in. This one wasn't a call for help, not directly. It was a warning. Maddox's voice came through the static late one night, older, heavier. He didn't use the frequency properly, didn't even realize it was open. He was talking to his team, discussing routes, weather windows, risks. She listened without meaning to. The avalanche path he described tightened something in her chest. The numbers didn't line up. The storm pattern was wrong, snowpack unstable. She hesitated. Intervening now would mean breaking her own rules. No desperation, no cornered unit, just prevention, just involvement. She keyed the mic. Shift north, she said quietly, 30 degrees. There was a pause, then confusion, then trust. When the avalanche thundered down behind them half an hour later, she shut the radio off and leaned back against the cabin wall, breath shallow, heart pounding. She had crossed a line. Helping when asked was one thing. Watching over them was another. The realization scared her more than gunfire ever had. Because it meant she wasn't just reacting anymore. She was attached. And attachment was how you got careless. Weeks passed. She tried to pull back. Limited listening, shortened responses, no unnecessary movement. But the world didn't slow down just because she wanted it to. One night while tracking a distant transmission, she misjudged a ridge crossing. Her boot slipped. She slid 10 meters before catching herself, shoulder screaming as it took the weight. She lay there for a long moment, chest heaving, snow pressing into her face. If I fall here, she thought, no one will know. The idea didn't frighten her. What frightened her was how acceptable it felt. That was when the dreams changed. Not Mason anymore. Herself, standing beneath vehicles, watching teams fight and bleed without her, hearing radios crackle unanswered, seeing routes collapse because she chose not to be there. She woke up one morning with frost inside the cabin and the certainty that she was standing at the edge of something dangerous. Not death. Purpose. Purpose demanded sacrifice, and she had already sacrificed everything she could name. She cleaned her rifle slower that day, fingers stiff, movements deliberate. She checked her ammunition twice, then a third time, not because she needed to, but because ritual grounded her. The radio crackled again. This time the voice was unfamiliar, young, trying too hard to sound steady. "Mystery Channel," the soldier said. "I don't know if anyone's on this, but we're pinned. Visibility's gone. We can't see the ridge." Mara closed her eyes. The storm outside shifted, wind changing pitch. Snow tapping against the walls in a pattern she recognized instantly. She could reach them in time. Barely. The question wasn't whether she should go. It was whether she could keep doing this without losing what little remained of herself. She stood anyway. Because once you accept that you are something the world occasionally needs, refusing to be that thing feels like betrayal. Not of orders, not of flags. Of people. She stepped into the night, the storm swallowing her outline almost immediately. As she moved, she felt the familiar narrowing of focus, pain receding, doubt quieting, the cold welcoming her like an old companion. Out there, she didn't have to explain who she was. She only had to be precise. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the discipline and the distance, a small, stubborn hope flickered. That maybe one day, she wouldn't have to disappear afterward. That maybe redemption didn't always mean isolation. But for now, the radio guided her forward, and the storm opened its map. And once again, the Frost Widow answered. What does it cost to keep choosing the storm, when the storm starts choosing you back? The climb began before dawn, though dawn meant nothing up here. Light didn't arrive so much as hesitate, a faint thinning of black that suggested the world still existed somewhere beyond the snow. Mara moved without hurry because hurry was how you slipped, how you misjudged, how you died quietly and alone. Her shoulder protested with every pull. She ignored it. Pain was just information, and she had learned long ago how to decide which information mattered. The radio crackled again. Static first, then breathing too fast. She slowed her own pace instantly, syncing herself to the rhythm on the other end. Panic traveled through air like disease. If she rushed, she'd carry it with her. "Say nothing," she said softly, "just listen." The breathing steadied, not calm but steadier. The unit was pinned in a saddle between two ridgelines, enemy fire walking methodically, not reckless, not desperate. That told her enough. Professionals, patient ones, the kind that waited for mistakes instead of forcing them. She reached her firing position 40 minutes later than she wanted. That mattered. She lay prone behind a lip of ice and scanned through the scope, letting the world resolve itself slowly. Snow density was higher than forecast. Wind sheer unpredictable. Elevation difference compressed distance in deceptive ways. She adjusted, recalculated, and felt something tighten in her chest. This was the margin she used to dominate. Now it was just enough. The first shot dropped a spotter, clean, necessary. The second wounded a shooter instead of killing him outright. He screamed. That scream changed everything. The enemy accelerated. Rounds cracked closer. One skipped off ice and punched into her pack, tearing through fabric and insulation. The cold rushed in like punishment. She rolled, heart hammering, breath sharp. For the first time in years, she was reacting instead of dictating. "This is how it ends," whispered a treacherous part of her mind. Not heroically, Not saving anyone, just misjudging once. She pushed the thought aside and kept working. The pinned unit moved when she told them to, not smoothly, but enough. She bought them ground in pieces, one man at a time, one suppressed cough of the rifle per choice. When extraction finally came, she was bleeding from her shoulder and shaking from cold she couldn't fully fight anymore. She didn't leave cleanly this time. A round caught her leg during her withdrawal, a glancing hit that burned and numbed in equal measure. She made it 3 kilometers before her body decided it was done negotiating. She collapsed behind a rock outcropping and laughed once, bitter and breathless. "So this is it," she murmured to no one. She worked the wound with practiced efficiency, fingers clumsy but determined, wrapped it, injected what she had left, waited for the shaking to stop. It didn't. The radio sat heavy in her pocket. She could call for help. The thought felt alien, almost offensive. She had spent years ensuring no one ever had to come for her. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually she stood. Because that was what she always did. The cabin felt farther away than it ever had. Each step dragged. Snow climbed into her boots. Her vision narrowed. The storm pressed closer, louder, less forgiving. When she finally reached the cabin, she fell inside and didn't bother closing the door. She slept for 12 hours. When she woke, feverish and stiff, she knew something fundamental had shifted. Her body was keeping score now. Days passed, then weeks. She limited movement, ate poorly, listened less. The radio stayed mostly silent, or maybe she avoided the channels where voices broke. She told herself she was done. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low enough to stain the snow blood orange, she heard a transmission that wasn't military at all. A civilian distress call. Broken, fatting, a research team, weather station collapse, no armed enemy, just exposure time. This wasn't her lane. She stared at the radio as if it had offended her. If she went, she risked everything for people who hadn't chosen this life, who hadn't trained, who hadn't accepted the cost. But the storm didn't care about lanes. She went. The rescue wasn't clean, it wasn't precise. It was messy and exhausting and human. She hauled frozen bodies, gave up supplies she couldn't afford to lose, spoke more than she had in years. One of them, a woman barely conscious, looked up at her and whispered, "Are you real?" Mara didn't answer. When it was done, when the researchers were airlifted out and she stood alone again in the white quiet, she felt something unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not pride. Responsibility. That night she didn't clean her rifle. She sat by the lamp and stared at her hands, noticing the tremor she usually ignored. The scars, the discoloration, the signs of a body that had been pushed past reasonable limits and kept going out of spite. She realized then that staying invisible had protected her from scrutiny, but it had also protected her from help. She had built a life where no one expected her to survive. And she was tired. The next time Maddox called, he didn't need saving. He just talked about command, about the weight of knowing every decision left a mark you couldn't scrub off. He didn't know she was listening. She didn't interrupt. When the transmission ended, she felt the echo of something dangerous. Connection. She began leaving signs after operations. Subtle ones. A marker moved. A route altered. A piece of information passed indirectly. She never stayed, never spoke unless necessary. But she wasn't just reacting anymore. She was shaping outcomes. The intelligence community noticed patterns eventually. Anomalies. Units surviving engagements that should have gone worse. Weather warnings arriving too precisely. Enemy movements disrupted without attribution. They started calling it luck. She almost smiled at that. Luck was what people said when they didn't want to acknowledge effort. One afternoon, while monitoring channels, she intercepted something different. Not a distress call, not a warning. A directive. A black channel discussing an asset. Unconfirmed, Arctic-capable, female, extremely high value. They were looking for her. Not aggressively, not yet, but deliberately. She turned the radio off and sat very still. This was the cost of being useful for too long. Someone always wanted ownership. That night the storm came hard and sudden, hammering the cabin like it meant to tear it free from the mountain. Mara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind speak in voices she understood too well. She could disappear again, move deeper, cut all channels, become myth once more. Or she could accept that she had already changed the equation by staying. The next call came before she decided. Multiple units, confusion, a cascade of small mistakes compounding into disaster, no single hero moment, just a situation sliding quietly toward tragedy. Mara stood slowly, joints protesting. She checked her rifle. She checked the radio. She checked herself. And for the first time in years, she whispered something that sounded dangerously like a promise. "Okay," she said to the storm, "one more time." Not because she believed she could do this forever, but because walking away now would mean admitting that survival had finally made her afraid to live. She stepped out into the night again, knowing the balance was shifting, knowing the storm was no longer just a tool but a mirror. And somewhere in the distance, unseen and unacknowledged, forces were beginning to move in her direction. The Frost Widow was no longer just answering calls. She was becoming something the world was starting to notice. And that realization followed her through the snow like a shadow that refused to stay buried. When does survival stop being instinct and start becoming a liability? Mara felt it before she heard it, not the radio, not the wind, something subtler, a shift in pressure like the air itself had learned her name. The mountains had always spoken honestly to her. This felt different. This felt like being watched by something that didn't belong to the storm. She paused on a ridgeline as snow moved sideways around her, lowering her profile without thinking. Stillness had saved her more times than speed ever had. She lay there for a long moment, listening with more than her ears. Wind patterns, snowfall cadence, the distant echo of engines far below, muted but wrong for this hour. Someone was operating out here. Not lost, not desperate. Looking. She moved again, slower now, choosing routes that erased her presence even from herself. When she reached the next observation point, she saw the truth laid out beneath her like a problem she didn't want to solve. A temporary forward sight, heated tents, power signatures masked but not well enough, communications arrays tuned narrow and tight. This wasn't a rescue team or a patrol. This was intelligence. They weren't hunting a person, they were hunting an explanation. Mara felt something hollow open in her chest, not fear, recognition. She had stayed too long. For years, invisibility had been her armor. Now the pattern of her interventions had drawn a shape others could trace, survivals that bent probability, weather warnings that arrived just early enough, enemy collapses without attribution. She had become a variable, and variables get isolated. That night she didn't move, she didn't transmit, she watched, she learned. She memorized faces through thermal optics, counted rotations, logged call signs that weren't supposed to exist on any chart she knew. She thought of Maddox then, of his steady voice, of the way he trusted information without needing its source named. She wondered, not for the first time, how many people she'd saved only because they didn't ask who she was. At dawn, she withdrew deeper into the peaks and powered everything down. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same kind anymore. Days passed, then weeks, storms came and went. She rationed movement, staying ahead of nothing she could name but everything she could feel. She stopped answering most calls. Let some units solve their own problems. Let the world remember how fragile it was without her interference. Each ignored transmission cut deeper than she expected. One night she broke her rule. The voice was young, too young, a female lieutenant trying not to sound like she was counting breaths. The grid placed her unit in a bowl-shaped valley with converging weather fronts and rising enemy movement. No immediate firefight yet, just inevitability. Mara closed her eyes. She could hear Mason's voice again, not teasing this time. Just quiet, you can't save everyone. I know, she whispered. She answered anyway. The intervention was clean but costly. She guided the unit out through terrain that punished mistakes. She took no shots, only gave warnings, redirects, timing. When the unit made it to safe ground, relief flooded the channel. Gratitude, questions she didn't answer. As she cut the transmission, a spike of static flared across her secondary radio. Then a voice she didn't recognize. Whoever you are, it said calmly, professionally, we'd like to talk. Myra froze. The channel was secure, buried, one she hadn't used in months. She didn't respond. We're not here to arrest you, the voice continued. Male, controlled, not threatening. And we're not your enemy, but you're leaving fingerprints now, whether you mean to or not. She powered down everything and moved immediately, abandoning the cabin she'd built piece by piece over years. She left supplies, tools, even sentimental things she couldn't afford to carry. By the time dawn broke, the place was just another empty scar in the snow. She traveled for days without stopping, pushing her body harder than she had since the crevasse. Pain returned with interest. Her leg throbbed, her shoulder burned, her hands shook when she rested too long. She couldn't keep this up. The realization didn't break her. It clarified something she'd been avoiding. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of being controlled, of becoming an asset, a program, a tool wielded by people who'd never sit alone in a storm and decide who lived and who didn't. On the sixth night, exhausted and half delirious, she made a mistake. She crossed a ridgeline without fully checking her back trail. The ambush wasn't violent. No gunfire, no shouting, just a sudden wall of light and sound, flashbangs detonating in perfect sequence. Her rifle was kicked away before she could fully register the movement. Hands pinned her to the snow. Professional, efficient, careful not to injure. That hurt more than brutality would have. Easy, someone said close to her ear. You're not in trouble. She almost laughed. They brought her to a mobile shelter shielded from the wind. Warmth hit her like a physical blow. She hated how good it felt, how quickly her body leaned into it despite her mind's resistance. Across from her sat a woman in civilian winter gear, eyes sharp, posture relaxed in a way that signaled real authority. Colonel Barbara Hensley, she said, off the record. Mara said nothing. You don't have to talk, Hensley continued. But I'm going to anyway. You've saved American lives, Allied lives, probably enemy lives too indirectly. You've done it without orders, oversight, or recognition. That makes you dangerous. Mara met her gaze, then let me go. We can't, Hensley said honestly. Not completely, but we don't want to cage you either. That word, cage. It told Mara everything she needed to know. Hensley slid a device across the table, a radio, familiar frequency. We propose boundaries, she said. You stay off certain theaters. You don't engage directly unless absolutely necessary, and you stop disappearing after major interventions. Mara's jaw tightened. So you can put me in a box. So we can keep you from being hunted by people who won't ask nicely, Hensley replied. You think we're the first to notice you. Silence stretched. Mara felt something inside her fracture, not violently but cleanly, a choice forming whether she wanted it or not. I won't wear your uniform, she said quietly. I won't answer to schedules or optics, and I won't let you decide who I save. Hensley nodded. I expected that. They sat there, two women shaped by different kinds of responsibility, staring at the same impossible problem from opposite sides. Finally, Hensley spoke again. Then we do this quietly. You remain unofficial, unacknowledged, but not alone. We watch the watchers. We keep others from closing in. Mara exhaled slowly. This wasn't freedom, but it wasn't captivity either. It was compromise, the most dangerous word she knew. Why, Mara asked, why help me at all? Hensley didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was softer, older. Because sometimes the system needs someone outside it. And because someday, when everything else fails, I want to know there's a voice out there that doesn't belong to anyone. Mara thought of the storm, of the people she'd guided through it, of the ones she hadn't reached in time. She stood. I don't stay, she said. I don't check in. And if I decide to vanish again, you don't come looking. Hensley considered her for a long moment, then nodded, agreed. They returned her gear, her rifle, her radio. No handcuffs, no escort. When Mara stepped back into the storm, it felt different again, heavier but clearer. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was something worse. Known. Days later, Maddox's voice came through the channel again, not urgent, not afraid. Just tired. She listened, she didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said only one thing. You're not wrong. He didn't ask how she knew. As she moved across the snow once more, Mara understood the truth she'd been circling for years. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about deciding who got to write your future. And she wasn't finished choosing yet. What does redemption look like when no one is there to witness it? The storm arrived without announcement, the way it always did. No warning sirens, no dramatic shift in the sky, just a quiet tightening of the air as if the mountains themselves had drawn a slow breath and decided not to let it go. Mara stood on a ridge she hadn't named, watching clouds collapse into one another until the horizon disappeared. She felt the weight of the choice she had made settling into her bones, not the compromise, not the understanding with people who lived behind desks and spoke in controlled tones. The deeper choice. She was no longer pretending the world didn't know she existed. That changed everything. She moved anyway. Because movement was how she thought. Stillness invited questions she wasn't ready to answer. The radio crackled late in the afternoon, weak at first, then clearer. Not Frost Protocol, not a secret channel, just an open band cluttered with interference and fear. A pilot, female, voice strained but disciplined. Her aircraft had taken damage during a low-visibility recon run. Instruments degrading, fuel bleeding away in increments too small to panic over, yet. Mara closed her eyes and listened past the words, heard the hesitation between sentences, the careful way the pilot avoided saying the thing she was thinking. I might not make it. Where are you? Mara asked, already moving. The pilot startled. Who is this? Someone who knows the weather better than your instruments, Mara replied. Answer the question. Coordinates followed. High terrain, bad angles, no safe landing zones. Search and rescue wouldn't reach her in time if the storm thickened the way Mara knew it would. This wasn't a firefight. No enemy. No shots to place perfectly into distance. Just gravity, cold, and time. Mara adjusted her route and pushed harder than she should have. Her leg protested. Her breath shortened. She ignored both. The storm thickened exactly when she expected it to, swallowing sound and depth until the world flattened into white noise. She reached the ridge above the crash site just as the aircraft clipped the slope and skidded hard, tearing metal and throwing up snow in a violent arc. The pilot survived the impact, but not cleanly. Mara could tell from the way she moved, slow, careful, favoring one side. By the time Mara reached her, the pilot was sitting in the snow beside the wreckage, helmet off, eyes unfocused but stubborn. "I thought you were air traffic," the woman said hoarsely. Mara knelt without answering, checking injuries with gentle efficiency. Broken arm, possible concussion, hypothermia already setting in. "You shouldn't be here," the pilot whispered. "Neither should you," Mara replied. They moved together slowly toward a shallow cave Mara had already identified on her approach. No dramatic carry, no cinematic rush, just two women fighting physics with grit and patience. Inside the shelter, Mara worked quietly. Heat packs, insulation, small sips of water. She spoke only when necessary, voice low and steady, anchoring the pilot's awareness. The pilot watched her with growing clarity. "You're not SAR." "No," Mara said. "You military." "I was." The pilot nodded, as if that explained everything. "They'll ask about you." Mara met her eyes then, calm, unflinching. "You didn't see me." The pilot hesitated, then nodded back. "I didn't see anyone." They waited together for hours while the storm screamed outside, the kind of waiting that stripped conversation down to essentials. Pain, fear, relief, gratitude that didn't need words. When rescue finally came, guided by coordinates Mara relayed from a position she'd already abandoned, the pilot was stable, alive. That was enough. Mara left before the rotor wash settled. She traveled for days afterward, not because she needed distance, but because she needed time. The mountains shifted beneath her boots, familiar yet altered, as if acknowledging that something had changed between them. She thought about all the moments no one would ever record, the breaths she'd slowed, the routes she'd nudged, the disasters that never happened because someone listened to a voice they couldn't explain. She thought about Mason, about the girl he used to joke with between shots, before grief carved her into something harder and quieter. She had spent years believing survival demanded isolation. That connection was weakness. That staying unseen was the only way to keep going. She understood now how wrong that was. Staying unseen had protected her from recognition, but it had also protected her from forgiveness. Weeks later, Maddox called again, not because he needed help, because he needed to talk. He spoke about command, about the young ones under him now, about the weight of knowing you shape who they became, whether you meant to or not. He never asked where she was, never asked her to come back. She listened. When he finished, there was a long silence. "You ever think about stopping?" he asked finally. Mara looked out over a valley washed clean by fresh snowfall. "Every day." "But you don't." "No." "Why?" She considered the question carefully. Not the easy answer, not the myth. "Because stopping doesn't erase what I've seen," she said, "and it doesn't help the people who haven't been seen yet." He didn't respond right away. "Whatever you are," Maddox said at last, "I'm glad you exist." The line went dead. Mara stayed there for a long time after, letting the wind move around her instead of against her. She realized then that she wasn't running anymore, not from the world, not from herself. She was choosing. Choosing when to step forward, choosing when to stay back, choosing to help without needing ownership of the outcome. That was the difference. Months passed. Stories circulated quietly the way they always had. A shadow beneath a vehicle, a warning that came too early to log, a route that shifted just enough to matter. Officially, none of it existed. Unofficially, people listened more closely to storms. Mara returned once briefly to the place where she had fallen years ago. The crevasse was mostly filled now, softened by time and snow. She stood at the edge and looked down, remembering the darkness, the cold, the decision to climb. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't proud either. She placed a small marker in the snow, not a memorial, just acknowledgement. Then she turned away. As night settled over the peaks, the radio crackled softly at her side. Another voice, Another moment balanced on the edge of failure. Mara lifted the mic, breath steady, posture relaxed despite the miles behind her. "Say it again," she said gently. "I'm listening." And somewhere far below, someone breathed easier without knowing why. Because redemption doesn't always come with forgiveness. It doesn't always wear a uniform. It doesn't ask to be remembered. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It listens. It waits. And when the moment arrives, when the storm closes in and the math stops working, it acts.